Welcome, everyone. I see people are just coming in from the waiting room. My name is Radha Ruparal, and I am hosting this conversation today. And today we have a special conversation. So it is an event that's both the People First community and also the Learning Planet Festival together. And we have two special guests with us, François Taddei and Selena, our youngest ever guest in this space, 11 years old. So I'm really, really excited to have her. So the Learning Planet Festival is a festival around reimagining education. It's been running for the last month with a number of different conversations. And the People First community is a community that meets regularly. The idea is that if we want to reach sustainable development, we have to invest in people, particularly those voices who are most proximate to the challenges, and that includes our youth voices. And so we've got a community that's growing of more than 1,200 individuals and actors around the world across sectors who believe in this idea that we've got to invest in people first and in our collective leadership. So we've been hosting these talks for the last few years. And what we really explore is what's the kind of leadership we need and how do we develop it, and learning from members of our community. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our two guests, but then really allow them to introduce themselves. So François Taddei, he's a very visionary thinker, evolutionary biologist by training, and he has co-created this institution called the Learning Planet Institute. And I'm going to allow him to share a little bit more about that in just a moment. And then Selena Marwaha, actually, let me just get your name right. Selena Marwaha, and she is an amazing youth entrepreneur and advocate who started at 5 years old, spoke at COP as one of the headliners at 10 years old. And I just spent an hour with her yesterday and was so inspired. So I'm excited to turn it over to her in a minute to just introduce herself as well. And we'll just be in conversation for about 20, 25 minutes, the three of us. And then I'm just going to open it up to the group for questions. But let's start with, can you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about yourself and what's the vision of the Learning Planet Institute?
So I'm François. My role here is Chief Exploration Officer, which is another type of CEO. Indeed, I co-founded this space 20 years ago now. And everything we've done was co-designed by student for student. That's why I'm very glad Selena is present today. And I've seen Loic within one of our alumni in the chat. So maybe he can, say his own memories of being here a few years ago. So what we've been trying to do in the last 20 years is co-design learning spaces where students can develop their own projects. And there is different type of spaces we've been creating, but basically some of them are academic, some of them are physical. So we created masters and PhD. We have 7,000 square meters now. Interestingly, we've grown exponentially until for the last 20 years. And we just became recently a UNESCO center, category 2 center, and a UN university hub to co-design the future of learning with youth. And so we try to work under the Pact for the Future motto, which is let's take decision together with the future generations to make sure that we have the most positive impact we can on the future. And so that's a United Nations agreement and pact. And the main question is, how do we do this? And so what we try to focus on is doing the R&D and the co-design with youth about the best ways to try to do this. And what we did last week is we launched what we call the Learning Planet Academy, which is the idea is that it's a planetary academy teaching learners to care for self, others, and the planet. And for those that are sort of tired of the best in the world type of hyper competition that exists ever more in academic and school systems, and go towards best for the world. So how do we go from best in the world to best for the world? And how do we co-design this with students? And how do we empower them to co-create diplomas and learning environment more generally that can improve their abilities to align with what they want to do and what they see the world needs, and and do this under, UNESCO, UN University partnership so that they can get recognition for their engagement and what they're trying to do. And so we try to train them on things that are typically not available in most schools and universities, like learning to care about their mental health and their well-being, learning to be involved in democracy and peace building, and learning to take climate action and be engaged in sustainability. So that's the sort of things we've been co-designing with students, but that goes all the way to from the youngest age, like Selena, all the way to master's and PhD and university degrees that we try to, again, co-design with students for students that want to be the change they want to see in the world. So that's a short intro of what we do. I'm sure we can share more info on our website if you're interested.
Great. Well, we'll go into some of this in a minute, but before we do that, and that's such a great introduction, Selena, tell us a little bit about yourself. So just, maybe we'll just start with your story and then we'll get into how you co-create. But you started at 5 years old. Tell us a little bit about your story.
So, hi everyone, thanks for the opportunity. My name is Selena Marwaha. I'm 11 years old and I'm based in Dubai. My journey started when I was 5 years old, where I worked with the TEDx speaker Mara Mincer to create a park based on a desert habitat. The two winning designs were then combined into a real park that would be built in Boulder in Colorado. And my design and one other design were actually built in that city. And that really empowered me. So then I went on at 8 years old to do the Emirates Environment Group Seaweed Stockholm Water Innovation Challenge, where I was the youngest and only female finalist in my category. I created a water-saving toilet that has sensors in it that determines the size of the waste and then uses the appropriate amount of water to flush. In total, the amount of water it saves is like reduced by 35%. So I chose to do this project because I found out that a lot of water was wasted, like approximately 5 liters for one flush. And my innovation reduces that by 35.
That's pretty amazing, Celine. I mean, I was just impressed that you, like at 8 years old, you actually had that idea, and then you like started sharing some of this with others. So yeah, tell us a little bit about, well, now you've got out there, where have you been sharing these ideas with others? And yeah, how did that help you motivate you for other ideas?
So, in 2024 at COP28 in UAE, I was the youngest speaker and I spoke about artistic tech to empower the next gen of future innovators. What I mean by this is I spoke about technology and the earth and sustainability, but most importantly, I took my brother's painting, who was 5 at the time, where he had a flying car escaping from a forest fire with people inside it. And at the same time, protecting people from harm, but also spraying a fire retardant on the forest fire. Just because this reminded me that just because it is not possible now doesn't mean it's not possible later in the future.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, yesterday you just inspired me around. Always listen to young people because yeah, I just was inspired by your imagination, and sometimes we lose that as adults. So we're going to go into this a little bit more, but thanks, Lena. What a brilliant story by the age of 11 already. So let's go into it a little bit more. Francois, let me turn it back to you. And I've got a couple of questions, but let's just even start with we say when I said people first, you immediately said to me, well, next generation first. Like we co-create with youth. So can you give us like an example of what does that actually look like in practice? And then Selena, I'll ask you the same thing. Like what does it actually look like to build together versus sometimes we just involve, one young person's voice. Like what does co-creation look like? Francois, maybe give us an example from your end, and Selena, maybe how you're working with Francois.
Yeah, so I'll let Selena talk about what we're trying to do together. But to give you another example, 20 years ago, plus we started without any funding, just listening to students' needs and hearing that they were feeling constrained by the disciplinary boundaries of classical academic programs. And so what we did is we invited them to discuss what they would want, and we tried to have a little chat on a regular basis, and then we build 1 week together, and then they wanted a full year program. And then a year after, they said that they were learning so much more than in classical academic program that they asked us to apply to become an academic official program. So we co-created with them a master program, and then they said, this is fantastic. We would like to pursue with PhD. So we co-created a PhD program that is also interdisciplinary, where students choose their internship, choose their research program, and trying to do things that are meaningful but not possible in classical academic settings. So that was the launch of what we did 20 years back. And in the meantime, for instance, if you come to Paris, the students have co-designed the very building where we are. And, Selena has been in this building. So maybe you want to say a few words about what you liked in the building, Selena, later. But basically, what we try to do is systematically start from understanding the constraints of existing frames and try to evolve those frames to offer new degrees of freedom to students so that they can create projects that are impactful and meaningful to them. And so that's this evolving frame of freedom that we try to co-create with students, and they can have different shapes and forms, and because they, depending on what are the students' needs in a given time and space. But that's basically what we've been doing. But I guess Selena will talk about these sorts of things much better than I would.
Yeah, and one question before we do that, and then Selena, I'll ask you, how have you been co-creating with Francois? What does that look like? But Francois, when you said frame of freedom, can you share what that means? Just a practical example.
So, to some extent, I mean, if you think of music, for instance, a symphonic orchestra as is a frame, and it has some degrees of freedom, but clearly in the jazz band there is slightly more degrees of freedom because the music is not pre-written the same way. So you can co-create different frames of freedom. For instance, Selena, maybe you would want to talk about what a Fab Lab is in terms of degrees of freedom. It's much more degrees of freedom than the classical classroom, because suddenly you have access to technologies that can help you to transform your ideas into real world projects. So that's another frame of freedom. And the master we created a few years ago, we invited students to do free internship in free labs of different disciplines of their choice. So we created a new degrees of freedom and a new frame where they would be recognized for what they were doing. They would get a master and eventually, go on to a PhD or to, create their own social business or their own startups. But, that's because we co-created for them a space that basically is a midwifing space, in the sense of it helps give birth to new project, new ideas, and new impact.
Yeah, I love that. So not being constrained by the status quo or the way things have always been done. All right, now, Selena, make it practical for us. Help us understand, what does that look like in practice? So you've been co-creating with Francois. Tell us what you've been up to and what that experience has been like.
So I am very grateful for to have such good mentors such as Francois, and he has given me many really great opportunities. And when we met again in Wise, Qatar, near a sculpture of a spider where I think the dream weaving started, um, he mentored me to create a project to collect the stories from the children of the world, and the winning story will be showcased in COP31. So that's a way that kids can showcase their ideas to the world, so youth can be listened to, because we don't only inherit the future, we have to co-create it with those who own it now.
I love that. I love that. And Selena, let's talk a little bit about how do these partnerships really work in practice? So what do you get from adults like Francois, and what do you think that kids have to offer to adults that we adults might not have? And so, yeah, share a little bit about both.
So adults have experience more experience than children and more maturity than children, and of course, have more opportunities to offer us. But as well, what I think adults can get from children is children have no limits to their imagination. Just because something is physically impossible, the kid is not going to think, this is not possible. I'm not going to dream about it.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And what are some of the ideas that you've brought forward, like in some of these spaces? So yeah, even just with that platform, what are some of the ideas you have?
Instead of like the prototype website looking boring and formal, we've made it look like it's drawn in a kid's notebook with like an avatar picker so people can see who's making the stories and where you are in the world. So there are different stories about different topics that come from all over the world.
Amazing, amazing. I love that. And I think it's just such a good example of why, when we're actually doing this work, the people who are closest to it have the best ideas of how that makes it happen. All right, Fran, so I'm going to come back to you again, and then I'll come back to Selena, and then I'm going to open it up. Francois, you talk a lot about like what's the leadership or capacities we need in the world. So I'm just curious a little bit more if you can say a little bit more about the capacities that you're trying to build in the Planetary Academy for young people. And also, what does that require in terms of the leadership capacities we need in adults to be able to do this work? Yeah. So what are some of those, yeah, capacities we need? And Selena, I might ask the same thing of you in just a moment. Yeah, the capacities and supports we need, and I'll open it up.
Yeah, I guess open-mindedness and will to listen and will to learn and will to co-construct are, for me at least, some of the key dimensions that we try to foster among both adults and young ones. And we try to see, what it is that we can do together that we could not do alone. And we try to look at, the state of the world, which, if you look at the news, is not very bright. But we're trying to analyze, where do we come from, where are we, and where are we heading by default, using as much of the science and technology that we can. But then we realize that, the dominant narrative and the dominant trajectory is clearly not very healthy and not sustainable and not in favor of the future generations. So, how can we co-design with youth new narratives, hence the importance of Selena's project, but also what I tend to call ethical dreams. And so for me, a dream is ethical if it's not the nightmare of anyone, neither today nor tomorrow. And so, how can we, for instance, collect dreams, collect nightmares, and try to see, where there is a consensus that this is a dream scenario, where there is a consensus that this is a nightmare scenario, and let's, try to go for the dreams rather than nightmare. But when they collide, when, some people's dreams are nightmare for others, and I won't name anyone because I guess you all have some leaders name in mind that, have dreams that can be nightmare for many others. And so, how do we learn to avoid this sort of nightmarish perspective that some leaders might have? And how do we learn to train the next generations to dream ethically and to do this dream weaving in the sense of, trying to build the maximum compatible dream set that if your dream and my dream are compatible and you may be a dreamer like John Lennon said, but you're not the only one. You can come together and you can start building together these things. And so that's a way we can try to have intergenerational conversations, and that's lead to an ethical conversation by that by design. It's not ethics predetermined, it's ethics that emerge from everyone's perspective, including the youngest ones, including those that are not yet born, and that we want to include in the conversation as much as possible.
Amazing. And have you learned like what are the conditions that make that possible? So is it just we start by making sure the right people are in the room? Is it setting it up so people operate in a different way? Like, how does that look like in practice? Maybe just bring that alive for us, and then Selena, I'll come to you around what do you think we most need to develop?
So I think you have to have a space where people can be themselves, can be vulnerable, can remember that, as humans, we are born the most vulnerable of all animals, and we remain vulnerable throughout our lives at different degree, and that therefore we are interdependent. And so whereas most of the dominant narrative is about trying to be the best in the world and trying to compete and trying to be, this independent agent that can be in a winner takes all type of scenario, we learn that, this is not what we are. We are conditional cooperators. There is clearly settings where we'll compete if we have to, but there is the default mode that most humans prefer is actually a cooperative mode. That's where you can find meaning. That's when you can find peers and others that can help you do things you could not do alone. And that's a much more creative environment and a much more meaningful environment ultimately. So we can co-create the conditions for meaningful interactions, which research shows goes through creativity, cooperation, and doing something for more than yourself. So inviting everyone, but certainly the youngest ones, to understand what's the commons, what we have in common. It can be, a space, it can be a toy, it can be the planet, it can be the climate, the biodiversity. There's different type of commons we have. So understand what's a common and why by nurturing the commons, we can do things together that we cannot do alone. And that if we, on the opposite, compete and destroy the commons and pollute the commons, then, if we all need those commons, then our well-being and even maybe our lives and humanity can disappear by destroying those commons. So, trying to explain these things in a way that is not creating anxiety, but it's conductive to the will to cooperate, to learn from those commons and nurture those commons, rather than, again, compete for grades or compete for honors. I think that's what we're trying to do, really.
That's amazing. So what I hear like is in some ways we're moving from this mindset of me to actually seeing ourselves as we, like connected. What do you think about that, Selena? Um, how has that come up for you? Like, in some ways we operate, want to do the best for ourselves, but what have you learned around growing your own skills around understanding other people, cooperating, building things together?
I mean, a thing that has been like really important to me is having good mentors. I mean, I of course have been fortunate enough to receive very like accomplished mentors such as Francois, for example. But I also wish that all kids in the world had good mentors. But I've learned a lot of skills like leadership and speaking qualities, and as well as like I've learned to accept all ideas. And
Yeah. What are if there were skills that you think every kid should learn? What do you think? What do you think we should be learning today? Yeah. What are the skills or the opportunities? You said every child should have a mentor. Anything else?
I mean, they need to have leadership qualities because we are the next generation who are going to like inherit the future. But we also need to learn how to co-create with adults because
Yeah.
they are
Yeah.
much more experienced and mature than us.
Well, I think you're pretty mature here. So, and anything you've learned around co-creation, like what is that? What, like when it's worked really well with adults? Yeah. Like what's worked, and then when does it not work? And then after this, I'm going to open it up to others to get into the conversation. Yeah. But when does it look good? When does it not work so well?
Well, I would say it needs to begin with grown-ups having a mindset that kids need to be heard, that they belong. And let's open the doors and windows to all those spaces where grown-ups decide about our future and include us.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I remember yesterday when we were talking, you were saying, well, we shouldn't just have one or two of us at a conference. It should be many of us. So I just love that. I'm going to take that down and keep that in mind for myself as well. Wonderful. Well, let's open it up. Let's open it up for questions to the rest of the group, right? So we're here to think about what is the kind of leadership we need and what does it look like to create it. And we started to have a conversation around leadership that centers young people and co-creates with young people. But I'd love to just open it up for folks who have questions. You can put it in the chat or just raise your electronic hand. And yeah, let's open it up.
Um,
And maybe just introduce yourselves as we get
Hi,
started. Yeah.
everyone. Wendy from Teach for All. Um, I'm curious, Selena, what you see as the difference between, or the similarities between what happens in school and what happens through this kind of engagement. And Francois, I'm really interested in what you all like, if you could wave a magic wand and change, I don't know, three things about schools, what would you change, just given everything that you've learned?
I mean, there are a lot of differences and similarities in schools and these kind of opportunities. In schools, you learn social skills, teamwork, collaboration, but you also develop like leadership skills for like kids. And in these kind of opportunities, you got to utilize them and make decisions for the best of our future. So I think both are really, really helpful in like their own ways.
Yeah, and Selena, if you could, I'm gonna ask you the question that Wendy's asking Francois and then to Francois. Like, if you could change school in any way, like, what would you want to see change? Because you've had all these opportunities. Like, if you could wave a magic wand and run the school right now, what would you do differently?
I'd want every kid to have access to good mentors and access to the next gen technology and know how to use it.
Amazing. Yeah, amazing. And if you got other ideas, keep them coming throughout this. Francois, let's go to you. Yeah, with Wendy's question.
Yeah, I think I fully agree with what Selena said first, and second, I think that we have to change the incentives. So, for instance, one of the things we are currently discussing and is what would be, for instance, a planetary baccalaureate. So, what we know is, local baccalaureate, national baccalaureate have been defined under, national and local constraints. That includes political constraints, historical constraints, financial constraints, and so on. They are not necessarily up to date in terms of the technology Selena was talking about. They are not necessarily inviting kids to co-create. So, if we were to co-create what a planetary baccalaureate would be with Selena and her generation, what would it look like? How can we create these things? And then if we create a planetary baccalaureate, why stop there? Why not having a planetary bachelor, or at least planetary versions of existing bachelors or evolving bachelors? And what about masters, planetary masters and planetary PhDs? And so how do we create incentives that are aligned with the planetary needs and the youth needs, rather than, are sort of blocked into historical constraints that were designed in the 19th century and that are evolving much too slowly. And so that's the first things. And the second is, this is not just a redesign once and for all. This is a redesign that is an evolving design. So what if every generation of students was invited to say what they see as needed? And that can look hypothetical and complicated to do. So again, we've done it for masters and PhD and even for bachelor, and we believe we can do it for younger ones. And to give you one example, and maybe open some of the conversation that was asked by Sanaya, sorry, in the chat. We use, I guess, something that many of you know, named Model UN. So the simulation of the United Nations, where the students are very often self-organized and play the role of ambassadors of different countries to discuss planetary challenges that typically the UN is discussing. So this is very often a very inspiring conversation, but somewhat limited and somewhat frustrating because no one listens to you. You might have the best ideas in the world. If no one listens, that's frustrating. So we decided to go from the classical Model UN that has more than 1 million students every year involved to what we call Remodel UN, where we say to the students, no, we are now a little bit of the United Nations, And we also work with the UN Youth Office, with the UN University, with the UNESCO. And so we've asked questions to students involved in Model UN, telling them, we invite you to do a remodel of the UN because we want you to work on specific topics that we care about, and we want to listen to your voice, and we are going to implement this. So the first prototype we used was around what would be the charter, the student charter of a planetary academy, and we got, many students all over the world that gave us excellent ideas that we are now about to put in practice within the Learning Planet Academy that we are launching. But we want to do the same for, again, diplomas. We're discussing with UNESCO. There is going to be a post-2030 agenda beyond the SDGs. What about inviting the young people like Selena to say what should be the future from their perspective? We discussed this with UN Youth Office because this can become, a new standard in UN policy when they want to co-design all sorts of policies that needs youth voices. And so that's typically the sort of things we try to do, is to give something meaningful to do to answer Wendy's question. Give learners, even the youngest ones, meaningful question to address that motivates them, and that they can see that they can have an impact on the world. And it can be a planetary questions. It can also be a very local question. And there is other Ashoka fellow like Guy Etienne in Haiti, for instance. He does this sort of thing from 6 to 18. The kids there learn to co-create solutions to their challenges. And according to the Lego Foundation, even though it's an IT school, it's one of the best in the world to teach resilience, to teach co-creation, to teach the ability of indeed co-creating the future, as Selena was saying.
I love that, Francois. I mean, I just love it's an orientation. It's not just a one-off thing. And the piece that Selena had said, I'll bring up, is we've got to, like, we're creating these spaces, we've got to listen to the young people as well. So that's really powerful. Let me open it up. Sanaya, you had a question, and then I'll go to Loic. So Sanaya, if you could just come off mute and share one of your questions.
Sure, thank you. So, Francois, you answered part of these already, but maybe for the second question, as we think about youth-adult partnerships, intergenerational work together, as it becomes a little bit more common, more people are sort of willing to explore it and try it, have you all started thinking about how to measure its impact? And I'm curious because currently the way I try to use it in my work is if whatever we're doing is better, then only the youth could have done it, or only the adults could have done it because we're doing it together, then it's the right thing to be doing together. But I'm curious how you actually measure and evaluate the impact of these collaborations.
I mean, it's a good question. And I think we're just at the beginning of that journey, because we try to help students find something meaningful to them. So one of the ways that we've explored that is somewhat interesting, because it's transversal, because every project being different, it's difficult to make the sum of things that are different, because co-creation can lead to very different things that are co-created. So one of the ways so you can look for 21st century skills. How do you assess whether they learn to be more creative, more cooperative? They feel they have more agency. They feel that they can have a positive impact on the world. They have less anxiety when they look at the news, and they see not only crisis, but they see, like in Chinese, there's two characters in the word crisis: dangers and opportunity. So that they see the dangers, but they also see the opportunities, and they see that they can do something. And concerning the adults, do they see, people like Selena as exception, or do they see, the youth generation as a community of that can be empowered, and where we can co-construct with them? Can they trust the future generation? And also, I think there is another dimension that has been asked by the UN Youth Office, headed by Philippe Polier, that was with us last week. And, we were in different events together, talking about meaningful youth engagement. And meaningful youth engagement is giving voice to Selena and her generation. It's giving the ability to leaders to co-construct, but it's also transforming organization. And that's one of the other questions that was in the chat. And in this co-constructing, you want to transform the organization so that it's not just because there is an enlightened leader today that, you know, such conversation can happen. You want to change the institution in a way that, you know, there are processes that are there to facilitate such conversation, and processes that are humble enough to know that they have to adapt. They have to adapt to new technologies, to the needs of next generations, and they have to keep evolving, and know that in this Pact for the Future perspective of, you know, building, making the best choice for the future, we are humbly starting that path, and we have to keep improving. And so it's not so much to harness best practice as co-designing bettering practices, that is practices that can keep evolving and keep hearing use voices, and what new technology can do. For instance, what can AI change to develop what's called broad listening, meaning the ability to listen not just to one Selena, but to, you know, hundreds of millions of young people simultaneously.
Thank you, François. And Selena, I'll ask you the question. Like when you've worked together with adults, like how would you know it's successful? What shifts in you? Yeah. So I'm throwing you lots of questions I'm just putting them out there, but yeah, whatever comes to mind. And then I'll go to Loic. Yeah.
I would say when kids and adults co-create, the impact is not measurable as what we do is empowerment. And I think while we create, we learn and improve.
Yeah, so you're saying that like if you're really learning, and I think Francois, you're saying that in another way, right? Like if we're constantly learning, that's actually how we measure progress. So it's how do we develop systems where we're constantly learning. Thanks, Selena, for making that practical. Okay, Loic, we'll go to you if you can introduce yourself and share your question. Then I'll come back to some of the ones on the chat.
Yeah, thanks. So I went through the Learning Planet Institute as a master student a while ago. I think I graduated in 2014, something like that. So that's my main point of contact here. It's been really nice to hear from both speakers. I've been it's sometimes a bit hard to stay hopeful and stay proactive, let's say. Yeah, okay, I will select one question because I have a bajillion, but let's there's a lot of, how can I phrase that? How do you skillfully change the system for the common goods from in versus outside? Like it's something that's always I've seen François do really well over the years is like work from inside the system to like try to change it in a positive way. And sometimes you do need to go around, you do need to like go in a room that you're not supposed to go in and start doing the thing you wanted to do. Like, how do you skillfully navigate that? And what does that look like as a collective?
Yeah, Francois.
That's a question for both Selena and François. But
yeah. Francois, we'll start with you, and then Selena will get your thoughts as well. Yeah.
As Loic knows, and as you mentioned briefly in the intro, I come from evolutionary biology, and I've learned from viruses and bacteria that very tiny beings can have the most profound impact. You know, you can think of COVID. It's a tiny virus, and then yet it changed the world. Not for the best, but you know, it had the impact because it had the ability to hack our own cells and multiply and have all sorts of consequences that we mostly suffered from. So if you take that perspective, that if you choose right the place where you exert your action, you can maximize the leverage that you will have and the impact that you will have. And so, you know, for me, what's the minimal change that can have the maximum impact? And so, for instance, co-creating diplomas with students is a way to have impact, but that's not necessarily as scalable. Whereas if we invite every student to go from best in the world to best for the world, we've changed only one word, And yet we've changed, why we're going to school, what we are learning there, and, how are we measured and evaluated, and how can we have the impact that we need. So that's the sort of tricks I'm looking for. For instance, Model UN pre-existed, and we're trying to hack it to remodel UN. And for instance, the United Nations has a UN Charter, Article 109. If you don't know it, you can have a quick look. It's the article that says that the UN needs to be improved on a regular basis, except that that article has never been truly used, and even less with youth voices in it. But what about taking Article 109 and invite UN students in Remodel UN to help us remodel the United Nations? Because clearly it is currently failing. And what we know is that when there is no global governance, we had World War I, and when we had a bad global governance, we had World War II. So if we don't want World War III, it's time to remodel the UN. And you can use students' creativity, Article 109, technology that exists, and try to hack from the inside in order to maximize the impact. So that's my answer to Loic.
Okay, and then Selena, we'll ask you, and maybe the question is what are the changes you can make within your system? So it might be, you've gone out there and done things in the world. How do you want to change your own school or your own community? And it could be small things that you do within there, or do you have big ideas to change things even on a bigger scale? So yeah, what are some of your ideas within your own school? Little things you can do, but if you have big ideas too.
I mean, in our school, we do have we call them DICE lessons. They stand for design, innovation, something like that. Um, and we do projects in there, but they mainly involve we have a project in the UAE that's F1. I won't go into that, but it's mainly marketing and the aerodynamics of the car. But I think since it's innovation, there could be a little more technology that gets involved, maybe some programming or learning about the next gen technologies and how to use AI responsibly and ethically. I think that could be integrated into our lessons because as of now, a lot of people in our grade are just using AI to do their work for them. In science homework, no, we had to make a poster and nearly the whole class used ChatGPT. I don't object to the idea that ChatGPT can, of course, give us facts and help us. But if we let it do our work for us, that sort of defeats the purpose. So if we co-create with AI, we can have much better results. So I think that should be integrated into our lessons in our school.
That's amazing. I'm going to come back to you afterwards and ask you all my AI questions because I think you've got some really good thoughts here of how we do it differently. Amazing. Let's keep going to some of the questions in the chat. So we've got actually Tremor. Maybe you can come off mute and just share. I really love your question around how do we bring others into this, policymakers, those who shape the system. Yeah. Do you want to just say a word about that, and then we'll open it up. Francois, if you've worked with policymakers.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Selena. Very nice to meet you. And François. No, I'm just coming from policy and was working at the Open Commission. And the question I'm putting on the chat is really something I'm still struggling with because I'm obviously a strong believer in co-creation processes, and I know and I see, I've witnessed how it works. And it provides some solutions that are really sustainable, precisely because they are based on co-creation. In a way, you're doing all the job before, and then when the thing is ready, it has been discussed by everyone, so it works. But I've seen also how sometimes it's difficult to get in, to bring in the policy people in the process. You manage to put around the table the students with the teachers, educators, and parents and education stakeholders. When it comes to people who are the very one who are supposed to design the policies, then sometimes it's a bit difficult. And obviously, we know we won't get into the detail of the conversation. We know why it's the case, various reasons. But the fact is that it's a struggle still sometimes. So that's my question. Do you have some suggestions to bring in these people within the discussion because we need them as they are the one designing the policies?
Yeah, Francois, let me throw that to you. That's a good question. How do we bring policymakers and just others who maybe don't have this orientation yet?
So I think there is three type of policymakers in there. Okay, there are those that there is no way you could drive them in. Okay, and so I have no answers to those except maybe vote them out if you are in a democratic country. That is, so that's quite challenging. There is those that will do it spontaneously, and it's a tiny minority, but you can certainly work with them and try to prototype things and make the proof of concept that those things work when they take the time. And I've had I've been lucky enough to have been contacted by some of them, and so being able to work with some of them. And I won't give any names because that's we're not here to do name dropping. But I think there is some, and we should definitely honor them and work with those. And then there is the intermediate category, which has no idea this is even possible, and may want to try, but would not know where to begin. And so if you document well the work done by those that like the prototype, and if you build an advocacy, and if you manage to touch their heart, I mean, the ideal is to touch their heart. Okay, so that's super hard, but there is a subcategory of young people that can touch the heart of the toughest leaders, which is their own children. Okay, and so if you manage to have a viral movement among youth, at least some of them will be children of decision makers, and they can go and say, hey, dad, moms, why don't we change something? Why can't we listen our generation? And usually those intra-family conversation happens. Okay, much more than intergenerational institutional conversation, but they can be facilitated by some of those. And at least a good way to invite these leaders is to invite them to write a letter to their children or their grandchildren or their great grandchildren that are not yet born, so that they put themselves in the shoes of the future generations. And so you can play with these little tricks. Okay, nothing is perfect. There is no magic bullet, but at least some of this tend to work and can be tried. And one way, because there was another question that is somewhat related about, what about a young person that will want to be involved and is somewhat lost? I've seen this in the chat. And, for instance, invite those kids to project, say, in 2060 or 2080, okay, depending on their age. So an age where, we will not be here, and they will be in charge, and they will be able to see the consequences of their actions. And so if they start seeing the future they want, then you can back propagate and tell them, how do we start? What's the next move? What's the first move that should be taken? And so you can do these sorts of conversation intergenerationally, separately, and then together, and then learn to weave those perspectives and learn to do things that certainly no single generation could do alone. But by coming together, you can start having the impact that is needed.
Thanks, Francois. I love the plea to also creativity. It's taking something from young people to not get stuck. And Selena, I'll ask you this question. I mean, you don't maybe work with policymakers, but you work in, you're in a school. You might have a school leader or some teachers or adults who do listen and others who may not have naturally. Have you learned anything around how change happens? Like, how do you get everybody to listen to young people, or do you start with some? Yeah, what have you learned around how change happens?
Well, I did meet a couple of policymakers at COP28 and
Very
COP29. I was watching a panel talk and I asked a question to Francesco, who is the Italian Minister of Sustainability and was also one of the co-chairs of COP29 presidency, about how does he feel in the face of disasters that occur every day in various countries in the world. And that made him think deeply about it, like Francois, and said that policymakers often forget at the end of the day, it's about happiness and feelings of the entire humankind.
Wow. Wow. I'm glad I asked that question. Thank you, Selena. That was brilliant. Well, let's do this. We've got one more question in time for one more question, Arturo. And then what I'm gonna ask both Francois and Selena to do, so Selena, if you want a second to think about it, is like anything else you haven't shared that you want to leave us with, or what do you most want us to remember? But before we do that, Arturo, um, if you could share your question.
Sure. Thank you so much. Wonderful conversation. Former Teach for America executive director, and now spending this chapter of my life trying to create these spaces to co-create with young people. I think Francois spoke to this, and I was thinking, how do you think about the invitation, like as adults trying to make an invitation to the next generation? It sounds like you got to do some due diligence to have an opinion about a pain point or a solution or the future. So, but Francois, if you could speak more about that as we try to bring young people together, what should we be thinking about as adults in making that invitation so that it's compelling to them as they come to co-create? It's mutually beneficial for both generations or multiple generations. And for Selena, if she's still on, the same. As you think about working with adults towards solving a problem as a young person, what do you think about in trying to make an invite to older generations to work with you? Thank you.
Selena, you want to start for a change?
Francois, let's start with you because Selena's just come off, and I think I see her coming back in. So we'll start with you, and then I'll give her the question. I think her Wi-Fi
Yeah,
is.
I think that conversations around dreams and nightmare can be somewhat useful because if you start listing the dreams of one generation, the nightmare, and trying to see how they can be much more complementary than we imagine. For instance, I'm pretty sure that there is a common nightmare of humanity, whatever the generation, which is extinction. Uh, and having been in Nagasaki and Hiroshima last summer, I know that we are not that far from that moment, and I know that the people that suffer the worst nightmare. I've been able to have amazing dreams, including the dreams of universal peace and the dream of nuclear disarmament, a dream that was actually acknowledged by a Nobel Prize winning for peace. So I think, and it's interesting because this is a dream that's passed on several generations of survivors. That are now called ibakushas, and I've been really admiring them for their resilience and for their ability to overcome that trauma using creativity, art, and storytelling to overcome the worst and dream for the best, and do this intergenerationally. And so I think that most communities on the planet have had some trauma, if not all of them. And if whatever trauma you communities have been through can be processed in such a creative ways and such inspiring ways as was done in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I think that's a way to start from where do we come from, where are we now, and what do we want to avoid for the future. But then you can also say, what do you want to dream for the future? And then, you can start seeing that some people's dreams are sometimes nightmares unwillingly. To come back to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as a physicist, I know that Einstein and Marie Curie had beautiful dreams about understanding, what atoms were, and yet they contributed to Hiroshima and Nagasaki nightmare. So unless you're invited to dream ethically as early on as possible, you may get involved in creating nightmare for others. And so we have to understand that it's very good to be curious and understand the world, but you have to be responsible, and you have to be responsible in the way we are using our discoveries. And if you are making amazing discoveries, you have to know that it will give humanity amazing power, and it might give people that are not that ethical powers to destroy. So we have to be aware of these things. And so I think we have to co-create the conditions for intergenerational conversations about these dreams and nightmares, and this and co explore what ethical dream weaving might mean. And for me, it's just the beginning of a conversation around these themes. But if I have one memory from, the deepest emotion I've ever felt in my life in Nagasaki, that's this. We have to protect the next generation dreamers. And that's, the promise I made to a fourth generation Ibakusha, an 11-year-old, and that asked me what I wanted to protect. And I say, I want to protect the next generation dreamers. That was the first time I was thinking like this, but it was the first time I was asked that question by, someone same age as Selena. And her grandmother went through the worst nightmare. And, if we want the next generation to be able to dream, we have to help them and empower them to be able to do so in an ethical way.
Francois, I love that. Like, we have to power the next generation of dreamers. And with that, I actually want Selena to have the last word in this conversation. So, Selena, thank you so much for joining us, first of all, so late at night for you, and just running with all the questions we have. I've just been so inspired by everything that you've shared and just what you're up to in the world. What's your final thought? Anything like, what do you most want us here to leave with? It could be something you've already shared or something you haven't had a chance to share. I'm going to give you the final word.
Firstly, I'd like to apologize for coming off the meeting. My battery ran out. Um, and what I think that I'll leave you on is that the future will never be at the best that it can be if the adults that own it now don't give the youth a chance to say what they want in theirs.
Brilliant. Well said. It's a call to action for all of us. I am going to include many, many more young people in all of my conversations from now on. Thanks to you, Selena, and what you've brought us. Big thanks to both of you for the wisdom you've brought and the creativity you're bringing, and just the spirit, like the real spirit of being in dialogue. I know for me, it's inspiring me much more around how do we have these intergenerational conversations and really bring young people more into every conversation. So big thanks for anyone who wants to continue being part of the People First community. In the chat, we'll paste a link to how to get involved. We're going to be sending out a recording and a summary of this talk. So please do share. You can share it widely because I think there's so much wisdom to be gained here. And our next talk will be with Patrick, who leads one of the leading universities in Africa, in Ghana, and they are building ethical entrepreneurial leaders and doing some really innovative stuff around cultivating the next generation. So we'll send out more on that talk very soon. Thank you both for being with us and for all who participated, and we look forward to being together very soon again.